Flooded fields, endless wars, and the world's richest trading empire. At first glance, it sounds impossible, a contradiction too great to exist. Yet this is the story of the Netherlands, a country whose very identity was forged in paradox. For centuries, the Dutch fought not only rival kingdoms, but also the sea itself, carving a home out of fragile marshes and shifting rivers. They built dikes to keep their land dry, ships to rule the oceans, and cities that dazzled the world with wealth and culture. Theirs is a history of survival and ambition, of small provinces that defied mighty empires, and of a people who turned vulnerability into strength. How could a land so often under threat give birth to both desperate battles for survival and towering masterpieces of art? How did a nation no bigger than a postage stamp rise to become a global superpower? By the 1st century BCE, Rome's expansion had pushed steadily north from the Mediterranean until it reached the great rivers of northern Europe. The Rhine became the decisive line of separation between the empire and the peoples beyond. This natural boundary, known to the Romans as the limes, marked the northern edge of their world. South of the river, imperial governors extended Roman administration and fortifications, pulling the territory into a wider provincial system. North of it, however, the empire stopped. The result was a land divided, where Roman influence met the shifting power of Germanic tribes, setting patterns that would echo throughout later centuries. The southern lowlands were formally incorporated into the province of Germania Inferior. Here, Roman presence was more than military, it was administrative as well. Towns, garrisons, and supply depots tied the region into Rome's larger network. Latin inscriptions, imported goods, and even Roman coinage circulated widely. Yet that reach had clear limits. Beyond the Rhine marshes and bogs, imperial armies found it difficult to penetrate. Northern groups remained outside of direct control, living in scattered communities that carried on older traditions. This frontier status created a cultural fault line dividing north and south, one that never fully disappeared from Dutch history. Among the frontier tribes, one stood out for its particular role: the Batavians. Settled in the river delta, they occupied a landscape both rich and perilous, shaped by channels and wetlands that protected them from enemies. Rome struck an agreement with them, allowing self-governance in exchange for military service. This bargain turned Batavian communities into one of the most reliable sources of auxiliary soldiers for the empire. Roman generals prized these warriors for their discipline and fighting skill. They served far from home, in Britain, in the East, and even in the Praetorian Guard, protecting emperors in their palaces. The unusual relationship made the Batavians both allies and subjects, trusted yet closely watched. That trust shattered dramatically in 69 CE. Led by Julius Civilis, the Batavians staged a revolt that convulsed the Rhine frontier. They drew in neighboring tribes and crushed Roman detachments, cutting supply lines and threatening key cities. For more than a year, chaos spread, coinciding with political crisis in Rome itself. Civilis nearly carved out an independent state before the empire recovered and reasserted authority. The uprising was among the largest in the western provinces, and though it failed, its memory lingered across the delta as proof that imperial power could be shaken. Even amidst conflict, Rome left enduring traces. Engineers cut roads through the lowlands, linking forts known as castella that guarded major crossings. Canals were carved to move goods and troops more efficiently. At Nijmegen, or Noviomagus as it was called, a sizable settlement developed, today recognized as the oldest city in the Netherlands. Archaeological finds here and elsewhere show imported pottery, military equipment, and the imprint of cosmopolitan life reaching into what had once been swampy isolation. Life on the frontier also demanded small adaptations. Roman soldiers stationed in the cold, damp climate often wore socks inside their sandals. Archaeologists have recovered footwear with traces of fabric stuffing, a practical adjustment rarely imagined when thinking of classical legions. In another testament to survival, the line of forts they built is so well preserved that in 2021 the Lower Germanic Limes was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. These remains illustrate Rome's determination to secure its edge, even in hostile terrain. When imperial authority waned in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the frontier dissolved. Garrisons emptied, towns shrank, and the divide between Romanized South and tribal North widened again. Yet Rome did not vanish entirely. Traditions of law, construction, and military organization blended with Germanic ways of life. Out of that mixture emerged a cultural foundation on which later societies of the Netherlands would rise. When the Roman legions withdrew from the Rhine frontier in the 5th century, the Low Countries were left without a strong central authority. The old structures of fortified towns and military camps fell into decay, and the wide river valleys and coastal marshes became contested ground for new powers. Into this vacuum stepped several Germanic groups, whose language, culture, and shifting alliances would shape the fate of the region for centuries. The first of these were the Frisians, who controlled the windswept coastlines stretching from modern-day northern Netherlands into northwestern Germany. Their homeland was harsh but rich in opportunities for those who mastered the sea. Salt marshes provided grazing land, and shallow waters sheltered fishing grounds. Frisians became recognized for their skill as traders and seafarers. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Frisian merchants were regular visitors to markets along the North Sea and English Channel, forming contacts as far away as Britain and Scandinavia. Their ships made them highly mobile, and raiding became as common as commerce. It is for this reason that they are often compared with the Vikings who appeared later, though the Frisian maritime tradition predated the Scandinavian longship raids by generations. South of this coastal world, the Franks emerged as a cluster of tribes into a formidable kingdom. They first established themselves under the Merovingian dynasty, and by the 6th century, they were a dominant power in northern Gaul. Their leaders extended influence into the southern Netherlands through conquest and alliances, gradually incorporating the fertile river valleys into their growing realm. With the rise of the Carolingian dynasty in the 8th century, the Frankish state transformed into an empire that sought not only political control, but also religious uniformity. This authority extended across much of Western Europe, maintaining close connections to the territories that would later form the Netherlands. To the east, overlapping with the woodland uplands and rivers, Saxon groups contested territory with both the Frisians and the expanding Franks. Their society was less centralized, operating through kinship ties and war leaders. Tensions between these Saxon bands and their neighbors led to centuries of intermittent conflict, especially as Frankish rulers attempted to distribute Christian influence into regions that remained firmly pagan. The eastern borders of the Netherlands thus became zones of frequent turmoil, a patchwork of unsteady alliances. Within this landscape, one figure came to symbolize resistance: King Redbad, also known as Radbod. Ruling the Frisian kingdom in the late 7th and early 8th centuries, he stood against Frankish power and rejected Christian missionaries. Contemporary sources describe him as a defender of traditional gods and a determined opponent of submission to the south. His armies clashed repeatedly with Frankish forces until he was finally overcome by Charles Martel. The Frankish leader, remembered for halting further expansion of Islam into Europe, also pressed north against the Frisians, forcing their elites into submission and arranging the baptism of their subjects. Missionaries were central to this process of integration. Figures such as Saint Willibrord established bishoprics and sought to root Christianity in the northern provinces. Another missionary, Boniface, met a dramatic end in 754. While traveling near Dokkum to preach, he and his followers were ambushed by local opponents and killed. This event was remembered as martyrdom and became symbolic of the fierce resistance encountered by missionaries in the region. Legends about Redbed illustrate this clash of faiths. He is said to have refused baptism after being told that his pagan ancestors would be destined for hell, remarking that he would choose to remain with them rather than enter heaven with his enemies. Whether literal or not, the story captures how deeply identity and belief were bound together in this era. Linguistic ties also reveal continuity from this period. Modern Dutch and Frisian stand among the closest relatives of English, reflecting the shared roots that connected Frisians and Saxons with the settlers of early medieval Britain. In this sense, the North Sea acted less as a barrier than as a bridge, fostering family ties and cultural exchange. When the Carolingian Empire fractured in the 9th and 10th centuries, its authority in the Low Countries collapsed. What remained was a patchwork of territories that reflected local power rather than imperial unity. Great lords, bishops, and counts built castles, issued laws, and collected taxes across their fragmented lands. This was no single kingdom, but a mosaic of smaller ones, each with its own ambitions. Out of this environment emerged some of the political entities that would dominate medieval Dutch history: the County of Holland on the western coast, the Duchy of Brabant inland, the County of Flanders in the south, and the Bishopric of Utrecht in the north-central region. Boundaries often overlapped, disputes were common, and alliances shifted constantly, creating a political map that never stayed still for long. This fragmentation had consequences. It prevented any one dynasty from dominating the Low Countries entirely, but it also enabled a culture of autonomy in towns and pockets of local authority. Merchants and guilds benefited from this balance, gaining influence where rulers sought their taxes and military support. In practice, this system encouraged a kind of negotiation between rulers and subjects, an early form of representative politics. City councils and estate assemblies grew to protect urban interests, and this negotiation-based political style would become an enduring feature of Dutch governance. Among the rising powers, the Counts of Holland played a particularly prominent role. Their domain began as a small territory on the coast, constantly threatened by flooding seas and rival neighbors. Over the centuries, through a mix of warfare, diplomacy, and strategic marriages, the Counts extended their reach. The most famous among them was Floris V in the 13th century. He secured access to new lands, strengthened the position of peasants against abuses by rival nobles, and won a reputation as a protector. Floris became so popular that he was sometimes called the Kierling god, or peasant's god. But his popularity also made him dangerous to aristocratic rivals. In 1296, he was betrayed and murdered while in captivity, an event that shocked his subjects and became a defining moment in the history of Holland. While political rivalries shaped the land, the economic fortunes of the Low Countries soared. Wool imported from England fueled a vast textile industry in Flemish towns, especially Bruges and Ghent. Their factories and workshops produced cloth that was sold across Europe, creating fortune for merchants and workers alike. Coastal trade routes connected Baltic grain to Mediterranean goods, making the region a hub of exchange. Flanders turned into one of Europe's most prosperous centers, its wealth visible in fortified cities, stone churches, and bustling markets. At the same time, the church retained enormous secular control in certain areas. In the bishopric of Utrecht, bishops were not only spiritual leaders, but also territorial princes, commanding armies, collecting revenues, and governing lands. Their dual role meant that religious and political authority were blended in ways that often brought them into conflict with neighboring nobles. These bishops stood as reminders that feudal Europe did not separate sacred and secular power neatly, and the Netherlands was no exception. A reminder of how towns asserted themselves is found at Dordrecht, which in 1220 became the first city in present-day Netherlands to receive official city rights. These rights were far more than symbolic. They allowed the building of defensive walls, the holding of regular markets, and the minting of local coinage. A community with rights had independence from feudal overlords, an ability to protect its wealth, and greater say in its governance. Such privileges turned towns into powerful institutions in their own right, often balancing noble and ecclesiastical authority. By the 14th century, the Low Countries had developed one of the most densely urbanized societies in Europe. More people lived in towns than in the countryside, a striking contrast to most of the continent. This urban orientation reflected the deep integration of commerce, trade, and labor into daily life. The conditions of life here were centuries ahead of the rural dominance that characterized much of Europe. In the late 14th century, a new power rose to dominate the Low Countries. The House of Valois-Burgundy, a cadet branch of the French Royal Navy, began to expand its reach across the lands we now know as Belgium and the Netherlands. Unlike the fragmented political map of counties and duchies that had characterized the region for centuries, the Burgundian dukes used a subtle mix of inheritance, purchase, and strategic marriage to knit together territories that had never been governed under one authority. Their success created a turning point, drawing the patchwork of towns and lordships into something resembling a larger state. The starting point came with Philip the Bold, the youngest son of the French king, who married Margaret of Flanders in 1369. Margaret was a powerful heiress whose dowry carried not only immense wealth, but also a collection of territories at the heart of Europe's trade networks. Through this marriage, Philip inherited control over Flanders, Brabant, Hainaut, and eventually Holland, Zeeland, and Utrecht. What had once been fiercely independent counties were now drawn into a shared dynasty. By the middle of the 5th century, the Burgundian dukes ruled over nearly all of the Low Countries, which became known collectively as the Burgundian Netherlands. For the first time, one dynasty held sway across both north and south, creating what historians call a de facto unified state. Among the Burgundian rulers, Philip the Good left perhaps the deepest mark. His reign lasted more than 40 years, and during that time he pursued both expansion and centralization. Under him, the States General was assembled, a representative body that brought together delegates from the towns and provinces. Though designed to strengthen ducal power, the assembly introduced a tradition of collective politics that endured well after the Burgundian rule collapsed. Ideas of negotiation, consensus, and representation became firmly embedded in regional governance, foreshadowing the role of representative institutions in the Netherlands centuries later. Economically, the Burgundian era produced immense prosperity. Towns like Bruges, Ghent, and Brussels stood at the crossroads of European trade, linked by canals, rivers, and roads that tied merchants to markets as far as Italy and the Baltic. Bruges, in particular, rose as the financial capital of Northern Europe, attracting bankers from Florence and Genoa alongside German and English traders. Markets overflowed with English wool that supplied a thriving textile industry, while Flemish cloth was exported far and wide. The mix of French chivalric culture with the entrepreneurial habits of Dutch and the Flemish merchants made these towns glittering economic centers, unmatched in Northern Europe at the time. The Burgundian court also fostered a cultural golden age. Lavish tournaments and banquets displayed wealth and political power, but the influence was not limited to pageantry. Music flourished, and the visual arts reached international audiences. Painters such as Jan van Eyck pioneered techniques in oil painting that gave startling realism to portraits and religious works. Their style shaped European art for generations and placed Flemish artists at the forefront of innovation. One banquet by Philip the Good became legendary for offering more than 100 different birds to guests, from peacocks to swans, in a display meant to astonish rival courts with sheer extravagance. The scale of wealth flowing into these territories was extraordinary. By the middle of the 15th century, the tax revenues collected from Ghent and Bruges alone surpassed those of entire established kingdoms. At certain points, the Burgundian dukes commanded more resources than the King of France himself, a remarkable reversal given their origins as a junior branch of the royal family. Yet this wealth carried risks. The concentration of power and spending created pressures that pushed the dukes into conflicts with their neighbors and often strained the loyalty of their subjects. The dramatic climax came in 1477, when Charles the Bold, the last great Burgundian duke, was killed in battle while trying to extend his territories. His sudden death left his daughter Mary of Burgundy as heir to a vast but vulnerable domain. To stabilize her position, she married Maximilian of Habsburg, heir to another powerful dynasty. That union shifted the Netherlands from French to Habsburg influence, introducing a new chapter of foreign rule whose consequences would shape the coming centuries. When Charles the Bold fell in battle in 1477, his ambitions for a Burgundian kingdom ended with him. His daughter, Mary of Burgundy, suddenly became the most desirable heiress in Europe, controlling territories that stretched across the wealthy Low Countries. To secure her inheritance, she married Maximilian of Habsburg, the future Emperor Maximilian I. With this marriage, the Burgundian Netherlands passed into the orbit of the Habsburg dynasty, tying the region to one of the most powerful families in European history. What began as a union born from dynastic necessity would transform the future of the Netherlands for centuries. Their grandson, Charles V, inherited a collection of crowns that made him the most powerful monarch of his age. Born in Ghent in the year 1500, he would eventually rule Spain along with its American colonies, Austria and its Alpine dominions, the Netherlands, and authority over the Holy Roman Empire. His dominions stretched so wide that contemporaries said the sun never set on his empire. Despite his enormous realm, Charles showed a clear connection to the Netherlands. He grew up among Dutch-speaking courtiers, learned several local tongues, and maintained a personal identity tied to the region of his birth. His sense of belonging, however, did not prevent him from demanding enormous resources from the provinces to fuel his unending wars. The 16th century brought constant conflict as Charles battled France, the Ottoman Empire, and Protestant princes within Germany. To sustain these campaigns, the Netherlands faced heavy taxation. Their rich cities, bustling with international trade, provided crucial revenue. Beyond taxes, Charles sought to reorganize his scattered territories more systematically. In 1549, he introduced the Pragmatic Sanction, a sweeping measure that legally unified the 17 provinces of the Low Countries. Though each region retained traditions, the sanction framed them as a single political entity destined to pass together to his heirs. This act helped forge an early sense of unity but also concentrated authority in Habsburg hands, undermining local autonomy that towns and estates had long defended. Religious change deepened discontent. As the Reformation spread, Calvinist communities sprang up across several provinces. Charles remained committed to Catholic orthodoxy and launched campaigns of persecution against Protestants. Local authorities enforced edicts requiring conformity, with executions marking public punishment for heresy. For a society accustomed to some breadth of debate and negotiation, such rigid religious enforcement caused alarm. Economic dissent, political centralization, and religious oppression formed a dangerous combination that loosened loyalty between the Netherlands and their Habsburg ruler. When Charles abdicated in 1555, weary from decades of warfare, he transferred his inheritance to his son, Philip II of Spain. Unlike his father, Philip lacked close ties to the Low Countries. He grew up in Castile, spoke little of the local languages, and ruled from afar. His government style leaned toward authoritarianism, with little tolerance for negotiation. To the Dutch provinces already chafing under heavy burdens, Philip's distant and rigid approach deepened alienation. The enforcement of religious conformity hardened further during his reign, accelerating resentment. The Habsburg dynasty itself carried peculiar habits that revealed much about its decline. Determined to maintain their bloodline, they repeatedly married close relatives. One striking example came when Philip II married his own niece, continuing a cycle of inbreeding that led to widespread genetic disorders in later generations of the Spanish royals. Such obsessions with preserving dynastic purity contrasted sharply with the more pragmatic approach of the merchant towns they ruled, where alliances shifted easily in pursuit of advantage. At its zenith under Charles V, the Habsburg Empire stretched over nearly 1/4 of the world's population and territory. Yet such vast possessions required endless resources to defend, supply, and administer. The Netherlands, wealthy though small, ended up contributing disproportionately to this imperial machine. As their tax obligations grew and autonomy shrank, unrest simmered more intensely. By the time Philip II asserted his authority, dissatisfaction had moved past grumbling into open opposition. These tensions, sharpened by faith, finance, and political identity, set the stage for one of the most significant uprisings in European history, the Dutch Revolt. By the 1560s, frustration in the Netherlands had reached a breaking point. Philip II of Spain governed the 17 provinces with little attention to their traditions of negotiation and local control. Heavy taxation drained the wealth of cities that had become among the richest in Europe, while the enforcement of Catholic orthodoxy punished those who had converted to Protestantism. Local nobles feared that their authority was being stripped away as royal officials and Spanish troops tightened control. Towns that had prided themselves on their independence for centuries now found their liberties under threat. Together, these pressures created a society poised for confrontation. The spark came in 1566, during an eruption of anger known as the Beeldenstorm, or iconoclastic fury. Crowds of Protestant sympathizers, sometimes joined by ordinary townsfolk, stormed into churches across the provinces. Statues of saints were smashed, altars torn down, and stained glass windows shattered. For those who participated, it was an act of religious defiance, a rejection of the Catholic hierarchy they saw as corrupt. For the Spanish crown and loyal Catholics, however, it was an intolerable insult. The destruction left hundreds of churches ruined and made clear that resistance to Spanish authority could no longer be ignored. Philip II responded with overwhelming force. He sent one of his most feared commanders, the Duke of Alba, to restore order. Arriving in 1567 with a hardened army, Alba wasted no time in imposing terror. He established a tribunal called the Council of Troubles, which the Dutch soon nicknamed the Blood Council. Thousands were tried and many executed as suspected rebels or heretics. Confiscations of property, mass arrests, and brutal punishments turned entire communities against the crown. Instead of restoring order, Alba's methods deepened the resentment that had already been simmering. In this crisis, William of Orange, also called William the Silent, stepped forward. Born into nobility, he had initially served Philip II as a loyal administrator, even attempting to negotiate between the king and his subjects. Over time, he became convinced that compromise was impossible. William positioned himself as a leader capable of uniting both Protestants and moderate Catholics under a common cause: opposition to Spanish tyranny. He turned from diplomat to strategist, organizing resistance that would eventually blossom into full-scale revolt. As fighting dragged on, the provinces realized the need for a more permanent alliance. In 1579, 7 of the northern provinces signed the Union of Utrecht. The treaty bound them together in both military defense and political cooperation. While the war was far from over, the Union is often seen as the moment that a Dutch identity began to crystallize. It marked a transition from scattered uprisings into a coordinated movement that could stand against one of the greatest powers of the period. Although the conflict did not immediately end, Spanish control in the north weakened steadily. The revolt fractured the unity of Philip's empire and revealed the determination of a small but resourceful people to protect both faith and freedom. By the late 16th century, the provinces of the north had carved out a position that Spain could never fully reverse. What emerged was the foundation of a new kind of state: small, rebellious, and fiercely independent. In 1581, several Dutch provinces made a proclamation that formally cut ties with King Philip II of Spain. Known as the Act of Abjuration, this document was more than a statement of rebellion. It was a direct rejection of monarchy as an unquestionable institution. The provinces declared that if a ruler failed in his duties and instead oppressed his subjects, he forfeited any right to govern them. This argument was radical for the 16th century, when kings were widely believed to rule by divine authority. In effect, the document advanced an early theory of government that linked legitimacy not to lineage, but to the consent and welfare of the people. Declaring independence was one thing, making it work was another. At first, the provinces searched for outside rulers to replace Philip. Some approached Elizabeth I of England, who provided military support but declined an official crown. Others courted the Duke of Anjou, brother to the French king. Both experiments failed, leaving the provinces without a clear sovereign. The failed attempts revealed something new. They did not need a foreign prince. Years of conflict had already forced them to cooperate in military and political matters, so self-governance became a natural solution. By 1588, the provinces solidified this experiment by forming the Republic of the Seven United Netherlands. In an era dominated by kings and dynasties, this was astonishing. The Republic was structured as a federation rather than a centralized state. Each province retained its own autonomy with its own laws and customs, but they came together through a collective States General to handle issues of war, diplomacy, and finance. This system was not efficient by modern standards, but it reflected the long Dutch tradition of negotiation and compromise. Power was shared, not imposed from above. Religion played an important role in shaping this new republic. Calvinism had become dominant in many northern provinces, yet the Republic stopped short of enforcing strict uniformity. While Catholics faced restrictions, there was enough space for religious minorities, including Mennonites, Lutherans, and eventually Jewish refugees, to find shelter. This openness, relative to neighboring countries, gave the Republic a reputation for tolerance. It also attracted waves of immigrants who brought wealth, skills, and networks that enriched Dutch society. Refugee artisans and traders from across Europe built communities in cities like Amsterdam, Leiden, and Rotterdam, turning them into hubs of innovation. Commerce joined tolerance as a cornerstone. Freed from Spain's heavy taxation and freed to chart their own policy, the Dutch prioritized trade. They built fleets that sailed the Baltic Sea for grain, the Atlantic for fish, and beyond for spices and textiles. The Republic grew quickly into one of Europe's economic engines, its ports and shipyards linking markets from the Indies to the Americas. The fact that this growth happened while they were still technically at war with Spain highlighted the resilience of the new state. Formal international recognition, however, was slow in coming. Spain refused to acknowledge defeat for decades. Only in 1648, with the Peace of Westphalia that concluded the 30 Years' War, was Dutch independence accepted officially by other European powers. This meant that the Republic had fought and endured for nearly 80 years before gaining unambiguous acknowledgement of its sovereignty. The act of abjuration is now sometimes remembered as a predecessor to later declarations of independence. Written nearly 2 centuries before the United States issued its own, its language about rulers losing legitimacy influenced early Enlightenment ideas of the social contract. Equally remarkable is that a relatively small republic managed not only to survive constant wars against one of the richest empires of its age, but to thrive at the same time. Independence was not merely survival. It marked the beginning of a new order based on trade, tolerance, and representative governance, a type of state that would become a model of modernity in the centuries to come. In 1602, the Dutch Republic made a decision that would reshape not only its economy, but global trade itself. Rival trading groups, each competing for Asia's lucrative spice markets, were merged into a single entity, the Verenigd Oostindische Company, or VOC. The new company was awarded a monopoly on Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope and west of the Strait of Magellan. With this charter, the VOC became the first multinational corporation in history. Cities and investors could purchase shares, and for the first time, ordinary people could buy and sell pieces of a company on a formal exchange. Modern capitalism, with its system of shareholders and corporate governance, began in Amsterdam with this institution. The scale of the VOC's operations was staggering for the time. Fleets of sturdy Dutch ships crossed thousands of miles to reach markets in the east. They traveled to the islands of Indonesia, the ports of India, the harbors of China, and occasionally as far as Persia. Cargoes brought back to Europe included pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, silks, tea, and Chinese porcelain. These goods not only enriched shareholders, but also flooded European consumers with luxuries that had once been rare. Amsterdam became a hub where products from distant markets were collected, priced, and resold across the continent. The company's ambitions went far beyond trade. From its earliest voyages, the VOC sought to control strategic points along sea routes. In 1619, it established Batavia on the site of present-day Jakarta as its headquarters in Asia. Dutch forces drove out local rulers and reorganized the city into a fortified center of administration. Batavia became the heart of a growing empire of ports, plantations, and garrisons. Through military campaigns and alliances, the VOC extended control over key locations in the Indonesian archipelago and beyond. What had begun as trading voyages turned into colonial rule, with the company acting as a state within a state. This unique charter granted powers normally reserved for governments. The VOC could build forts, mint currency, negotiate treaties with Asian rulers, and, when necessary, wage war. These privileges gave company officials enormous influence. In practice, it meant a private corporation could command armies and dictate terms overseas without waiting for direct orders from the Dutch Republic. The company, however, was not remembered solely for its commercial success. It enforced control with ruthless methods. Dutch commanders imposed strict monopolies on spice production, destroying crops outside their control to maintain high prices in Europe. Resistance met with violence. In 1621, in the Banda Islands, VOC forces massacred much of the population after local leaders resisted giving the company exclusive rights to nutmeg. Survivors were enslaved or expelled, and the islands were repopulated with foreign labor under Dutch supervision. Such events underscored the darker side of corporate empire building, where profit came before human cost. The immense wealth generated by these ventures is difficult to imagine. During the 1630s, the VOC's market value, adjusted to modern terms, exceeded that of today's largest corporations combined. It stands as the most valuable company in recorded history. Wealth also brought unusual opportunities. In Japan, where foreign contact was tightly restricted, the Dutch gained a unique position. From their small trading post on the artificial island of Dejima, they were the only Europeans permitted to remain through Japan's long era of isolation. For more than 2 centuries, the Dutch maintained this window into a closed society, trading porcelain, silver, and knowledge of Western science in exchange for Japanese goods. By the 18th century, corruption and inefficiency weakened the company. Competition from other European powers grew, while administration of far-flung colonies became increasingly costly. In 1799, after nearly 2 centuries of operation, the VOC was formally dissolved. Yet by then, it had already altered the trajectory of Dutch history. It had catapulted a small republic into the ranks of global economic superpowers, while also entrenching a legacy of exploitation and colonial domination in Asia that would resonate for generations. The 17th century is remembered as the Dutch Golden Age, a time when the small republic at the edge of Europe became the leading maritime and commercial power of the world. Dutch ships sailed across every ocean, delivering goods back to markets in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and exporting European products to distant lands. While Spain and Portugal had opened the first oceanic routes during the previous century, it was the Dutch who perfected the use of those routes for sustained and systematic trade. Their dominance was not just about numbers, it was rooted in a deep mastery of naval technology, organization, and cartography that gave them a lasting advantage during this period. By the middle of the century, the Dutch possessed the largest merchant fleet anywhere in the world. Commercial records and port logs reveal thousands of ships under their banner, moving grain, timber, and fish across the Baltic, carrying spices and textiles from Asia, transporting enslaved Africans and plantation crops across the Atlantic, and circulating silver and manufactured goods throughout Europe. No other European state could match the scale or efficiency of this network. The sea became so central to daily life that it reached into every corner of Dutch society, creating employment not only for sailors and soldiers, but also for builders, mapmakers, and dock workers. By some estimates, 1 in every 10 Dutchmen was directly involved in navigation or maritime trade, a proportion unmatched anywhere else in Europe at the time. Central to this success was the innovation of shipbuilding. Dutch shipwrights introduced the vloot, a cargo vessel that revolutionized seaborne commerce. Unlike heavily armed warships, the vloot was built for volume and economy. Its design reduced crew requirements and increased cargo capacity, allowing Dutch merchants to transport goods at far lower costs than their rivals. Along with this came advances in charts and navigation. Dutch cartographers produced detailed maps of coastlines, sea routes, and wind patterns, providing their sailors with reliable tools for global journeys. These innovations gave the Republic a commercial edge that lasted for decades. While the East India Company dominated trade with Asia, the Atlantic required another instrument. In 1621, the Dutch West India Company was formed to compete with Spanish and Portuguese influence. Its role was multifaceted: to establish colonies in the Caribbean and the Americas, to intercept enemy shipping, and to manage the growing trade of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. The company established New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, planted colonies in Suriname and Curaçao, and occupied key territories like the Cape Colony in southern Africa. Through these footholds, Dutch ships could dominate transoceanic routes, refuel, and carry commodities back to Europe. At the same time, piracy against enemy nations became a regular practice, with Dutch privateers seizing valuable cargoes and weakening Spain's empire. Naval supremacy was not nearly commercial. The Republic fought a series of wars with England and Spain, where admirals such as Michel de Ruyter gained enduring fame. Dutch fleets, often outnumbered, won remarkable victories by exploiting superior maneuverability and discipline. One of the most dramatic episodes came in 1667, when Dutch squadrons sailed up the River Thames, penetrating the English heartland. They even captured the flagship Royal Charles, towing it back to the Netherlands as a trophy. The ship's carved sternplate still survives in Amsterdam museums, a reminder of that audacious victory. This period of success lay foundations for a global sphere of influence that would persist for centuries. But dominance also brought conflict. Rivalries with England, France, and Spain ensured that prosperity was accompanied by near constant warfare. The very innovations that made the Dutch powerful also drew envy and hostility from other European states eager to claim a share of global wealth. The Golden Age of the Netherlands is often remembered for trade and naval strength, but the 17th century stands out just as much for its cultural and intellectual achievements. With new wealth arriving from every corner of the globe, society shifted in a way rarely seen in Europe at the time. Instead of palaces and churches as the main patrons of artists and thinkers, it was now the urban middle class, merchants, artisans, and well-to-do citizens who commissioned works. That change of patronage produced a very different kind of art, one that reflected not kings and saints, but the everyday life of households, the pride of guilds, and the confidence of a prosperous republic. This explains why the streets of cities like Amsterdam, Haarlem, and Delft filled with painters producing on a scale the world had never seen. Rembrandt focused on psychological storytelling with dramatic plays of light and shadow, capturing human struggle in faces and gestures. Vermeer turned inward and painted quiet interiors, studying simple domestic scenes with extraordinary attention to detail and use of light. Hals showed lively portraits, brushstrokes quick and full of motion. Judith Leyster, one of the few celebrated female painters of the time, gained success with her vivid works of music-making figures and smiling children. Jan Steen, known for playful and sometimes chaotic compositions, depicted daily life with humor and wit. Collectively, these painters transformed how people viewed art. They made it something households could hang in a living room, not just sacred images destined for cathedrals. This was the century in which landscapes emerged as a genre of their own, reflecting the pride Dutch citizens felt in the polders, canals, and windmills that made survival in their watery land possible. Still lifes displayed tables crowded with fruit, shells, books, or musical instruments, each chosen to symbolize wealth, knowledge, or the fleeting nature of life. Portraits celebrated local militias, civic leaders, and family life, subjects rooted firmly in the world around them rather than stories from distant scripture. At the height of this boom, the population of the Netherlands was only about 2 million, and yet artists produced more than 1 million paintings in that century alone. While canvases filled walls, new discoveries filled books. The Netherlands became one of the centers of the scientific revolution. Antoine van Leeuwenhoek used microscopes, crafted by his own hands, to observe tiny organisms never seen before. With them, he discovered bacteria and protozoa, earning recognition as the father of microbiology. Christian Huygens worked across disciplines, contributing to physics, astronomy, and practical technology. He invented the pendulum clock, which became the most accurate timekeeping method of its age, and discovered Titan, one of Saturn's moons. Such work flourished because the Dutch Republic protected freedoms not common elsewhere in Europe. Ideas circulated widely, and many scholars considered the Netherlands the safest place to publish controversial works. Philosophers like Baruch Spinoza found space to write and challenge ideas about religion and government during a century when others across the continent risked imprisonment or exile for such writing. Publishing houses produced books at a scale unmatched in proportion to population. By the late 1600s, the Netherlands printed more books per capita than any other country in Europe, which made it the publishing capital of the continent. The vitality of this intellectual and artistic world did not exist apart from commerce. It was directly tied to global trade, shipped home in spices, silks, porcelain, and profits. Merchants reinvested that wealth not just in ships and warehouses, but in canvases, instruments, and books. In that mixture of worldly exchange and local creativity emerged a society that was both prosperous in material goods and rich in ideas, a combination unique to the Dutch Republic in the 17th century. In the 17th century, Amsterdam grew into the central hub of world finance. This transformation did not happen overnight. It emerged from decades of trading voyages that carried goods from Asia, Africa, and the Americas into Dutch harbors. As wealth from the Dutch East India Company and other enterprises poured into the city, merchants needed a place where money could be stored safely and where investments could be managed on a larger scale than ever before. Out of those needs, Amsterdam created tools that still shape the financial world today. The most significant of these innovations was the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. Founded in 1602, it was the world's first official marketplace for shares. Its first listings were the bonds and stocks of the Dutch East India Company, known in Dutch as the VOC. This structure allowed merchants, artisans, and even citizens of modest means to buy a piece of the company. Profit no longer depended on owning ships or taking personal risks at sea. Instead, anyone with enough saved money could invest in worldwide trade and receive dividends when voyages returned successfully. Speculation quickly became common, and investors bought and sold shares to profit not only from trade, but from shifts in demand and expectation. The establishment of the Bank of Amsterdam in 1609 added another layer of trust to this system. Before the bank, European trade relied on coins of unreliable purity and weight, creating confusion from one city to another. The Bank of Amsterdam offered a stable currency exchange, clear accounting, and the promise that deposits would retain their value. International merchants who had never visited the city before began directing their accounts through Amsterdam, confident that the new system would protect their money. It was this reliability that made the Dutch Republic a magnet for foreign business. Amsterdam traders continued to experiment with financial tools. They pioneered futures contracts, which allowed a buyer to lock in the purchase of a commodity at a later date, and options, which opened the chance to buy or sell shares depending on future prices. Short selling, another Dutch creation, gave traders the ability to profit from falling values, even if they did not own the asset themselves. What these instruments had in common was a general move away from physical goods toward the trade of potential gains. The modern stock market, with its complex strategies and risks, began here on the city's exchange floor. The money generated from this financial system reached far beyond business. It helped pay for wars that protected Dutch independence, built the canals and port works that shaped Amsterdam's landscape, and supported scholars and inventors who pushed scientific boundaries. Investors sometimes received their returns not as currency, but as goods, including spices such as cloves and nutmeg when the company's cash reserves ran thin. Even this showed the link between material trade and emerging financial systems. By the middle of the 17th century, investors from Venice, London, and Istanbul traveled to Amsterdam to take part in the exchange. Many of them did not even understand Dutch, but translation mattered less than the profits available in this remarkably advanced marketplace. With these developments, Amsterdam became the Wall Street of its era. Its innovations would ripple outward, influencing London, Paris, and eventually the financial centers of every continent. Rival empires would challenge Dutch strength at sea, but the city's invention of modern finance would remain one of its most lasting legacies. The Dutch Republic's astonishing rise in global trade and finance ensured that it would not remain unchallenged. Its ships moved more goods than any other fleet, its banking system stabilized currencies across Europe, and its colonies spanned oceans. With so much influence concentrated in a small republic, powerful neighbors began to push back. England and France, the two other emerging giants of the 17th century, saw Dutch wealth not as a distant marvel, but as direct competition. The stage was set for a series of costly confrontations that would gradually weaken Dutch dominance. The most direct struggles came in the form of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, fought between 1652 and 1674. These were not isolated conflicts, but three successive campaigns, each aimed at controlling trade routes, colonial markets, and naval supremacy. The English Navy sought to wrest control of maritime commerce from the Dutch, and the Dutch responded with determination. Victories were not one-sided. Both sides claimed triumphs in different battles, but one moment stood out as a display of Dutch audacity. In 1667, Admiral Michiel de Ruyter led a fleet up the River Medway, striking deep into English waters, burning ships, and even towing the English flagship back home. While celebrated as a daring success, the wars overall drained resources, disrupted trade, and showed the limits of sustaining constant conflict against a larger rival. If these clashes with England tested resilience, the threat from France nearly destroyed the Republic altogether. In 1672, a year forever remembered as the Rampjaar, or disaster year, Louis XIV launched an invasion with overwhelming force. At the same time, England, Munster, and Cologne also pressed against Dutch borders, hoping to carve up the Republic. What followed was a near collapse of the state. Cities braced for occupation, trade all but halted, and panic spread among the population. In an extraordinary act of defense, the Dutch opened dikes and flooded wide stretches of their own countryside, transforming land into shallow seas that drowned advancing French cavalry and halted further incursions. This desperate measure reflected a larger truth. Water, which had always threatened Dutch survival, could also be turned into a weapon of national defense. Amid these military struggles, the Republic faced internal divisions that weakened its ability to act decisively. Political factions had long split between the Orangists, who favored strong leadership under the hereditary stadtholders of the House of Orange, and the Republicans, many from wealthy merchant families, who resisted monarchic power and supported decentralized government. When external crises struck, these disagreements fed instability. Leaders debated not only strategy, but the very identity of the Republic, whether it should be a federation guided by merchants or a monarchy anchored by a single figurehead. Adding to the sense of vulnerability was the fact that Dutch innovations no longer remained unmatched. The shipbuilding designs that once gave them unrivaled merchant fleets were copied abroad. Other countries recruited Dutch craftsmen to bring those skills home. England and France both built formidable navies, improved their financial systems, and expanded colonies of their own. Gradually, the edge once enjoyed by the Republic disappeared, and the balance of power in Europe shifted. One leader rose in this turbulent period who briefly asserted Dutch importance abroad. William III of Orange ascended not only to national leadership, but, through the Glorious Revolution of 1688, became King of England alongside his wife Mary. This gave the Dutch Republic an extraordinary connection to the English crown and produced strong alliances against France. Diplomatically, this was a high point, but in practical terms, it pulled Dutch attention toward English interests, redirecting resources that might have gone into preserving their independent strength. Curiously, even as wars raged, Dutch shipyards remained so efficient that rival nations often employed their workers or studied their designs to improve their own fleets. This paradox revealed an irony of power. Dutch expertise was admired even by enemies who fought with them at sea. At their territorial peak, the Republic held more overseas possessions than any other power, stretching across Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Yet maintaining forts, trade posts, and fleets in distant waters required a flow of money and manpower that increasingly strained the small republic. The French Revolution swept across Europe in the late 18th century, and in 1795, French troops marched into the Low Countries, replacing the Dutch Republic with the Batavian Republic, a client state of revolutionary France. For nearly 2 decades, Dutch institutions were shaped by French rule. Napoleon reorganized administration, imposed new legal systems, and briefly ruled the Netherlands directly when his brother, Louis Bonaparte, was placed on the throne of the Kingdom of Holland in 1806. When Napoleon annexed the country in 1810, Dutch life was closely tied to his empire until its fall in 1813, when French troops withdrew. After Napoleon's defeat, the Congress of Vienna united the northern and southern provinces under King William I, creating the Kingdom of the Netherlands. This meant one monarch overseeing both modern-day Netherlands and Belgium through a union that would collapse within 15 years. The early 19th century was a time of transition, as the new kingdom searched for stability after years of war. By the 1820s, the groundwork for economic change was being laid. Industrialization, which had already transformed Britain and begun spreading into Belgium and Germany, was slower in the Netherlands. The country had long depended on overseas trade, seafaring industries, and agriculture, so there was less urgency to modernize factories. Another barrier was the absence of rich coal deposits, which meant the engines of early industrial technology were costlier to operate. While neighboring Belgium quickly became one of Europe's first industrial economies, the North moved at a steadier pace, focused on selective sectors where trade and transport still provided an advantage. Textiles emerged as an early center of production, particularly in Twente, where mechanization gradually replaced traditional weaving methods. Shipbuilding also remained critical, with Dutch yards adapting to steam power alongside their long-established expertise in wooden vessels. The 19th century also saw the rise of chemical industries, producing fertilizers, dyes, and later industrial chemicals used in manufacturing. By the late century, a new wave of innovation brought electrical engineering into prominence, with firms such as Philips, founded in 1891, beginning as small producers of light bulbs before growing into multinational powerhouses. These industries slowly diversified the economy, reducing reliance on trade alone. Infrastructure expanded rapidly during this period. Railways cut through the heart of the country, linking inland cities with the ports of Amsterdam and Rotterdam. Canals, some more than 2 centuries old, were modernized to handle steam-powered vessels. Steamships themselves transformed maritime commerce, reducing journey times and increasing the volume and regularity of goods transported. As a result, ports became the lifeblood of industrial progress. Rotterdam in particular grew with relentless speed during the 19th century, and its later 20th century position as the busiest port in the world traced directly back to this age of industrial expansion. With industrial growth came social change. Rural populations migrated toward factory towns, creating a new working class. Conditions in these urban neighborhoods were often harsh, with overcrowded housing, pollution, and low wages shaping daily experience. These divides between industrial laborers and wealthier citizens fostered the beginnings of socialist politics and labor movements demanding better treatment. Alongside these social tensions came the rise of pillarization, a distinct aspect of Dutch society. Communities organized themselves along ideological and religious lines. Protestant, Catholic, socialist, and liberal groups each established their own newspapers, schools, labor unions, and even sports clubs. This division provided stability in a fragmented society, but also reinforced separations between communities. By 1900, the Netherlands combined centuries of expertise in land reclamation with new engineering to create one of the world's most advanced water management systems. This capacity culminated in projects such as the Zuiderzee Works, which aimed to transform sea into fertile polderland. These remarkable undertakings showed how older traditions of controlling water were being carried into the industrial age with modern methods. The gradual industrialization of the 19th century did more than improve the economy. It reshaped Dutch identity, encouraged new political movements, and prepared the foundations of the welfare state. Institutions that defined modern society, social democracy, organized labor, and state planning, trace their origins to this time, when factories, ports, and new technologies began to dominate the landscape of the Netherlands. In 1815, after the fall of Napoleon, the Congress of Vienna redrew the map of Europe to restore balance between great powers. One of its key decisions was the creation of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. This new state merged the Protestant northern provinces, roughly modern-day Netherlands, with the Catholic southern provinces, which would become modern Belgium. The aim was to build a strong buffer state on the northern frontier of France, preventing another French expansion into the heart of Europe. The new kingdom was placed under King William I of the House of Orange, who reigned over both communities as a single monarchy, though unity was far more imagined than real. From the beginning, deep divisions marked the Union. In the North, Protestantism shaped society, politics, and authority, while the South retained a strongly Catholic identity. Religious difference became a source of resentment, since many Belgians felt that the king's rule favored Protestant priorities at the expense of their traditions. Language was another fault line. Dutch was promoted in administrative settings and education, even in French-speaking regions, creating frustration among Southerners who saw it as an imposition. Layered on top of this was the king's determination to centralize control from The Hague, reducing the autonomy Southern leaders expected. Economic divides added further tension. The southern provinces were far more industrialized than the north by the early 19th century. Textile mills, coal mining, and metal production gave them a modern, factory-based economy. Yet political power and funding for infrastructure projects often tilted toward the northern provinces, where the king concentrated support for Dutch elites and mercantile interests. Many in Belgium saw this imbalance as proof they were being exploited, their labor and industries taxed to enrich others while their own political voice remained limited. In August 1830, discontent flared into open rebellion. The spark came unexpectedly from an opera house in Brussels. A performance of La Muette de Portici ended with a rousing encore, and stirred emotion quickly spilled into the streets as nationalist feelings surged. Crowds shouted demands for change, and the protest escalated into armed clashes. What began as a cultural event turned into the starting point for a revolution. Within days, uprisings spread across Brussels and beyond, openly defying Dutch authority and calling for independence. King William I tried to suppress the movement by sending troops south, but resistance proved stronger than anticipated. Local insurgents fought back in cities and countryside alike, eventually forcing Dutch soldiers to retreat. What might have been a short revolt solidified into a broader war of separation. Meanwhile, the major European powers observed events carefully. Both France and Britain concluded that an independent Belgium would serve their interests by weakening Dutch strength and preventing any one nation from becoming too dominant along their borders. With this support, Belgian leaders gained international recognition faster than expected. Belgium's provisional government declared independence in 1830, establishing its own monarchy. But the Netherlands refused to acknowledge this breakaway. King William I held out hope that the southern provinces might return under his crown. Only in 1839, after prolonged diplomacy, did the Treaty of London force Dutch recognition of Belgian sovereignty. By then, the dream of unity had firmly collapsed. The revolution carried two unusual legacies. First, few nations can trace their independence back to an opera encore, making Belgium unique in its origin story. Second, the separation cost the Netherlands nearly 2/3 of its industrial base, a staggering economic blow. Yet this loss paradoxically made the Northern Kingdom more governable. No longer divided by language, religion, and economic rivalry, the Netherlands could focus on internal modernization and constitutional reform. What seemed a humiliation for King William I became a turning point that reshaped the Dutch state into a more stable, cohesive nation. When Belgium broke away in 1830, the Netherlands lost a significant part of its industrial strength, but what remained was a smaller, more unified kingdom. Without the tension of competing languages and religious identities between North and South, the government now had a more stable platform to modernize. The economy suffered in the short term, yet this setback forced the country to rethink its foundations. It was no longer enough to rely solely on trade and agriculture. Slowly, change arrived, and by the middle of the 19th century, industrialization began to take hold, though at a far slower pace than in neighboring Belgium or Britain. The textile industry in Twente became one of the first areas of industrial growth. Traditional craft-based production gave way to mechanized factories, where spinning machines and looms could produce cloth at a scale impossible for handworkers to match. Alongside textiles, agriculture also modernized with new tools and methods. Mechanization improved efficiency, although it displaced many rural laborers who migrated to the cities in search of industrial employment. Step by step, the Netherlands transitioned from a predominantly agrarian society toward an economy with manufacturing at its core. The transformation of Dutch cities symbolized this shift. Rotterdam expanded rapidly as merchants and shipbuilders adapted to steam power, building docks and ports large enough to service steamships. Amsterdam, with centuries of mercantile tradition, saw new railways and canals interlace its historic streets, connecting it to the rest of the country. Eindhoven, smaller but no less significant, emerged as an industrial town that would define Dutch industry in the century to come. Modern factories, railway stations, and bridges changed the physical shape of these cities and tied them more closely into global trade networks. Infrastructure projects accelerated this process. The North Sea Canal, dug between 1865 and 1876, directly connected Amsterdam to the sea, allowing much larger cargo ships to reach its harbors. For centuries, the city had been losing prominence to other ports, but the canal revived its role as a center of commerce. Rail lines across the country extended this effect, linking inland textile towns to coastal harbors, and uniting markets that had once been fragmented and slow to reach. The geography of the Netherlands, so long shaped by water management, was now also being shaped by iron tracks and steam power. Economic transformation came with deep social strain. Factory workers faced long hours, dangerous equipment, and low wages. Cities swelled as people left the countryside, and overcrowding, poor sanitation, and poverty produced unhealthy living conditions. These hardships fueled new political ideologies. Socialist movements gained support from workers demanding rights, while liberal reformers pressed for expanded representation and a reduction of royal authority. Confessional politics, focused on religious identity, also remained important among Catholics and Protestants who sought to defend their communities within the changing nation. This climate fostered the development of pillarization, or verzuiling. Dutch society split into separate pillars: Protestant, Catholic, Socialist, and Liberal, each building its own world within the same country. Each had its own newspapers, schools, trade unions, universities, and even sports associations. People could live their entire lives within one pillar, rarely interacting socially with those outside it. By 1900, the Netherlands was already one of Europe's most urbanized societies, yet paradoxically one of its most segregated because of this framework. Reforms eventually followed. In 1848, under the guidance of liberal statesman Johan Rudolf Thorbecke, the Netherlands adopted a new constitution that firmly limited royal power and created a parliamentary democracy. Later, universal male suffrage was introduced gradually, culminating in 1917, giving the growing working class full access to political representation. In this way, political structures adjusted to the social and economic pressures that industrial change had unleashed. Amid these shifts, new industries defined the future. In 1891, the Philips Company was founded in Eindhoven to manufacture light bulbs. From that modest beginning, it developed into a global electronics giant, illustrating how industrial innovation would propel the Netherlands into the 20th century. More broadly, industrialization reshaped society by disrupting traditional hierarchies and forcing the state to adapt. Out of harsh factory life and deep social divisions grew the movements, policies, and institutions that would later construct modern Dutch democracy and the welfare state. By the 19th century, the Netherlands moved from trading outposts and maritime companies to a direct system of colonial governance. Earlier ventures had given them footholds across the globe, but this century marked a tightening of control, especially in the Dutch East Indies. What had once been a network of coastal settlements and alliances transformed into the rule over entire islands and their populations. By the late 1800s, millions of people across Java, Sumatra, Borneo, and other parts of the archipelago were under Dutch authority, alongside Suriname in South America and Caribbean islands such as Curaçao. Dutch power spread far beyond Europe, even though the kingdom itself remained geographically small. The main driver of this colonial economy was the cultivation system, introduced in the 1830s. Under this policy, farmers in the East Indies had to dedicate a share of their land and labor to growing specific export crops. Coffee, sugar, and indigo were among the commodities most demanded by European markets. The products shipped out made fortunes for Dutch traders and filled government coffers, but the communities producing them lived in hardship. Food shortages were common as subsistence farming declined, and famine struck when poor harvests coincided with heavy export demands. What seemed efficient from the perspective of the Netherlands was experienced as poverty and exploitation for the people who worked the fields. The impact on the Dutch homeland was immediate. Revenues from the colonies financed public works, railroads, and industrial projects. Even grand urban buildings in Amsterdam and The Hague owed their existence to this flow of overseas wealth. The state benefited to such an extent that ordinary Dutch taxpayers paid relatively little compared to citizens in many other European countries. The golden edge of economic growth at home rested on the labor of people thousands of kilometers away who had little choice in the matter. After the cultivation system came to an end in the 1870s, the colonial model shifted. Large-scale private enterprise took over as plantations and mining ventures expanded. Dutch investors funded estates producing tobacco, tea, rubber, and palm oil alongside operations digging up tin and coal. These industries needed order and security, and the colonial government used military campaigns to suppress resistance, incorporating more territory across the islands. The Dutch presence was no longer limited to coastal forts or trading posts, but extended deep inland, bringing more of the Indonesian population under direct rule. For many citizens of the Netherlands, the colonial empire carried symbolic weight as a mark of national pride. The East Indies, Suriname, and the Caribbean were presented as evidence of Dutch strength on the world stage. Yet, not everyone accepted this view. In 1860, the writer Edward Does Dekker published Max Havelaar under the pen name Multatuli. The novel described abuses in the Indies, pointing out corruption, forced labor, and the suffering of local communities. It struck a chord with readers in Europe and inspired a movement of criticism that questioned the morality of empire. Meanwhile, in the colonies themselves, the seeds of nationalism began to grow. By the early 20th century, educated Indonesians started organizing associations and publishing newspapers that questioned Dutch authority and demanded rights. The colonial government often responded with censorship, arrests, and violent crackdowns. These measures could delay independence, but they could not erase the growing awareness among Indonesians of their shared identity and political power. Despite the scale of empire, most ordinary Dutch citizens never traveled to the colonies. Life in Java or Sumatra remained distant, an abstraction represented by imported goods and government profits. Colonialism felt profitable but detached, yet its influence at home was enormous. Between 1870 and 1930, the government consistently ran budget surpluses funded by colonial revenues. This financial cushion helped build the modern Dutch state, though it rested on extraction and domination abroad. The paradox was clear. At home, the Netherlands developed into a liberal constitutional democracy celebrated for political freedoms and cultural achievements. Abroad, in its territories, it operated as a restrictive and authoritarian power, enforcing systems of labor, profit, and control. The contradiction between these two faces of the same nation defined the later history of the Netherlands, and the unresolved tension would dominate the 20th century as anti-colonial movements gained strength. When World War I broke out in 1914, the Netherlands found itself in an extraordinary position. It was surrounded by nations engaged in total war: Germany to the east, Belgium to the south, and Britain across the North Sea. Many expected the country to be drawn in quickly, yet the Dutch remained officially neutral throughout the conflict. This decision spared the Netherlands from the physical devastation suffered by its neighbors, but neutrality in such a hostile environment demanded a constant balancing act that left lasting marks on Dutch society. The most immediate challenge came from geography. Dutch territory bordered Germany, and once German troops invaded Belgium, the Netherlands became the next obvious target for strategic pressure. The German government demanded concessions, pushing for use of Dutch infrastructure and resources to support their war effort. To the west, Britain maintained a naval blockade designed to cut Germany off from overseas goods. That blockade also crippled Dutch trade, which had been the lifeline of the national economy for centuries. The Netherlands walked a narrow path, refusing to allow its territory to be used by German armies while also negotiating with British officials to prevent total isolation. Neutrality was not declared once and then left unquestioned. It had to be constantly defended in practice. Dutch soldiers were stationed along the borders, railways and ports were closely monitored, and customs checks were tightened to prevent smuggling. As foreign spies used the Netherlands as a base to gather information and conduct secret operations. Border control became stricter than at any time in living memory, with citizens, merchants, and travelers subject to heavy scrutiny. The military also interned any foreign soldiers who crossed into Dutch territory, whether they came intentionally or by accident, a requirement of international law that kept the Dutch from being accused of favoring either side. Economically, the burdens of neutrality were severe. With major ports unable to operate freely due to the blockade, trade largely collapsed. Imports of essential goods dwindled, leaving shortages of food and raw materials. The government introduced rationing systems to distribute scarce supplies, but these were often unpopular, especially among urban populations. Inflation set in, eroding wages and intensifying hardship for the working class. The proud mercantile economy of the Netherlands, so dependent on international commerce, found itself squeezed between the demands of warring nations and the collapse of its main source of income. The humanitarian challenge was even greater. In 1914, after Germany overran Belgium, more than 1 million Belgian refugees fled north across the border seeking safety. The Netherlands, a country with only about 6 million inhabitants at the time, had never faced anything like this sudden influx. Emergency camps were built, schools and public buildings were converted into shelters, and food supplies were stretched even thinner. Some refugees returned home as the German occupation stabilized, but many stayed throughout the war, transforming towns and villages across the country. The presence of so many displaced people became a daily reminder that neutrality did not mean isolation from the suffering of the war. Despite these difficulties, the Netherlands succeeded in remaining outside the direct conflict. A detail that still surprises many is that in 1918, after Germany's defeat, Kaiser Wilhelm II fled across the border and requested asylum in the Netherlands. The Dutch government granted it, and he lived the rest of his life in the town of Doorn. Allied leaders demanded his extradition, but the request was politely refused, showing how carefully the Dutch defended their neutrality, even after the war had ended. What makes this period remarkable is the scale of the balancing act. The Netherlands shared a long border with Germany, housed more than 1 million refugees, endured trade collapse, and yet managed to avoid invasion. Few countries in Europe succeeded in such a strategy. Still, neutrality came with costs. The war exposed how vulnerable the Dutch economy was to outside pressures, and how fragile domestic stability could become during a crisis. These lessons would echo in the years ahead, when the rise of fascism and militarism across Europe would again test whether neutrality could protect the Netherlands from the storms of war. On May 10, 1940, Germany invaded the Netherlands without warning. Despite the Dutch declaration of neutrality, German forces advanced rapidly. For years, the Netherlands had counted on its neutral status to keep out of European wars, but this time the strategy collapsed almost immediately. After just 5 days of fighting, the German army forced surrender. The turning point came with the bombing of Rotterdam, which leveled large portions of the city center and killed nearly 900 people. Faced with the threat of similar destruction in other cities, the Dutch government ordered its forces to stand down. The invasion marked the beginning of 5 years of occupation. Life in the Netherlands quickly changed under Nazi rule. Curfews and strict censorship controlled daily routines. Newspapers and radio stations carried only propaganda approved by German authorities. Citizens faced forced labor, with thousands sent to work in German factories or military projects. Political opponents, intellectuals, and members of the resistance were closely monitored and often arrested. The atmosphere was one of constant pressure, and even ordinary conversations could lead to suspicion or denunciation. For much of the population, survival meant navigating a system designed to silence opposition and exploit the country for Germany's war effort. The occupation was particularly devastating for the Jewish community. More than 100,000 Dutch Jews were deported to concentration camps, including families who had lived in the Netherlands for centuries. The most widely known among them was Anne Frank, who spent years in hiding with her family in Amsterdam before their capture and deportation. By the end of the war, fewer than 5,000 Dutch Jews survived, giving the Netherlands one of the highest death rates in Western Europe. The scale of persecution revealed a grim reality. Nazi policies were enforced not only by German occupiers, but also with the cooperation of certain Dutch officials and police who collaborated in arrests and deportations. Resistance did exist and grew steadily over time. Underground groups printed illegal newspapers, spread information, sabotaged infrastructure, and provided food and false documents for those in hiding. Some families risked everything to shelter Jews or escaped soldiers. Yet resistance came with high risks. Captured fighters were executed or sent to camps, and entire neighborhoods could face reprisals for acts of defiance. Collaboration and resistance existed side by side, showing the moral complexity of life during occupation. By 1944, the war turned against Germany, but the Dutch population still faced some of the hardest months of the conflict. In the western provinces, food supplies collapsed as a result of a German blockade and disrupted transport. This period, remembered as the Hunger Winter, caused mass starvation. More than 20,000 people died, and countless others suffered long-term effects. Families relied on tulip bulbs, sugar beets, and whatever could be scavenged to survive. The crisis displayed both the desperation of occupied society and the cruelty of occupation policies. The Allied attempt to liberate the Netherlands in 1944 ended in failure. Operation Market Garden aimed to secure bridges across the country and push deep into German defenses, but it collapsed before achieving its goals. As a result, northern regions remained under German control until the spring of 1949. Final liberation came only on May 5th, when German forces surrendered to Allied troops. Cities welcomed soldiers with celebrations, but scars were everywhere, in the ruins of Rotterdam, in the memories of famine, and in the near destruction of the Jewish community. During exile, the Dutch royal family lived in Canada. An unusual event occurred in 1943 when Princess Juliana gave birth in a hospital room that was temporarily declared Dutch territory to ensure her daughter's full nationality. After the war, the Netherlands briefly annexed small portions of German land as reparations, though most areas were later returned. In the decades ahead, the memory of occupation shaped Dutch identity. Out of war and suffering, the Netherlands committed itself to democracy, to protecting human rights, and to preventing tyranny from taking root again. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the Netherlands faced physical ruin and deep social scars, yet the nation committed immediately to rebuilding. Homes, bridges, railways, and factories had been destroyed, and large parts of the population had survived years of deprivation. Reconstruction meant more than repairing buildings. It required reorganizing politics and stabilizing society around democracy and international cooperation. Unlike in earlier centuries, when the Dutch had stood apart or relied on neutrality, in the post-war world, they placed themselves within larger alliances, confident that joint action would protect sovereignty and foster recovery. Much of the early economic revival came through the Marshall Plan, an American initiative that provided funds and materials to restart European economies. Dutch leaders used this support to modernize industry, expand social welfare, and invest in infrastructure projects. By the late 1950s, the country had joined the ranks of Western Europe's most rapidly growing economies. Factories turned out steel, chemicals, and electronics, while Rotterdam's port expanded into one of the busiest shipping terminals in the world. Once again, trade returned as the nervous system of the Dutch economy, though it was now supported by strong industry and state investment. At the same time, the Netherlands took a forward role internationally, embedding itself in new institutions that defined the second half of the 20th century. It became a founding member of NATO, anchoring its security within an alliance intended to balance Soviet influence. It also joined the European coal and steel community, the forerunner to today's European Union, signaling a long-term commitment to continental integration. As a charter member of the United Nations, the Netherlands gained a reputation as a consistent advocate for law, peacekeeping, and human rights. The Hague even came to host the International Court of Justice, a recognition of the country's association with legal authority on the world stage. Domestically, the years after 1945 saw sweeping transformations. The welfare state expanded, offering pensions, healthcare, and unemployment protection that supported a stable middle class. Cities embarked on major programs of urban renewal, replacing war-damaged districts with modern housing and infrastructure. Social change moved quickly, especially in the late 20th century. Dutch society became known for tolerance and progressivism, with landmark policies in areas such as LGBTQ+ rights, regulated drug policy, and legal euthanasia. These decisions reflected a broader cultural identity that prized individual freedom balanced by collective responsibility. Engineering also remains central to national survival. The North Sea flood of 1953, which killed over 1,800 people, confirmed that water posed a greater long-term threat than any neighboring army. In response, the Netherlands launched the Delta Works, a vast series of dams, barriers, and locks designed to protect the southwest from the sea. This project became one of the largest water management systems in history. In the 21st century, the Dutch continued that tradition, creating climate-resilient architecture, floating neighborhoods, and new techniques for flood prevention. The same ingenuity that once drained marshes for farmland now positioned the Netherlands as a global leader in adapting to rising seas. Modern challenges remain, and they are no less complex than those of earlier centuries. Political fragmentation and the rise of populist movements have tested the consensus-based model that long defined Dutch politics. Immigration, integration, and questions of identity shape debates across the country. Climate change demands expensive adaptations to ensure the safety of land already lying below sea level. The legacy of colonialism, too, remains present, as Suriname, Indonesia, and Caribbean territories continue to influence Dutch memory and policy through calls for recognition and justice. Despite such pressures, the Netherlands maintains global influence far beyond what its size suggests. It is the world's second-largest agricultural exporter, made possible by advanced greenhouses, crop technologies, and high-yield systems that maximize limited land. More than a quarter of the country sits below sea level, yet it stands among the safest and driest societies on Earth, proof of engineering shaped by centuries of struggle with water. From the marshy beginnings of early history to its place today as a hub of trade, diplomacy, and innovation, the Netherlands demonstrates repeated reinvention. Small on the map, it continues to shape the wider world in ways that far exceed its borders. The history of the Netherlands is a story shaped as much by rivers, marshes, and seas as by people. What began as a constant struggle against water became the foundation of resilience, transforming vulnerability into remarkable strength, innovation, and global influence. If you enjoyed this journey through time, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into world history.